All right, let's jump right into this explainer. If you've been searching for a crystal clear way to summarize Malcolm Gladwell's fascinating work for a class discussion, a research project, or hey, maybe you're even scripting out your own YouTube video on the topic, you are absolutely in the right place. Today, we're unpacking his profound insights on why we so completely misjudge the people we don't know. I mean, we interact with unfamiliar faces every single day, right? Yet, as we're about to see, our internal radar for reading them is basically broken. We're going to start right here with a pretty massive paradox. Picture this. You're walking down the street and a stranger approaches you. They seem nice, calm, friendly. Instantly, you'd trust your judgment. We naturally just assume we can grasp someone's true motives, their intentions, maybe even their character, from just a quick, brief interaction. But the reality? We can't. We are almost always wrong. You see, strangers are incredibly hard for us to read because they usually don't act the way we assume they will, or honestly, the way we think they should. To get to the bottom of this, let's look at two major historical puzzles. To show you just how uniquely bad we are at reading strangers, look at these two massive historical failures by absolute experts. On one hand, during Fidel Castro's regime, you have a Cuban spy named Ana Montes. She basically walked right into the U.S. intelligence apparatus. She infiltrated the CIA and the DIA. Keep in mind, these are agencies filled with people explicitly trained to spot fakes. Yet Montes passed all her regular reviews without raising a single red flag. Why? Because she stayed completely calm. She never showed a physical trigger that would make anyone suspicious. On the flip side, jump over to 1938. UK Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain sits down face-to-face with Adolf Hitler. Now, leaders who hadn't met Hitler were deeply suspicious of him. But Chamberlain, after sitting in a room with the man, famously felt they understood each other. He actually declared Hitler was a man who could be relied upon when given his word. And, well, Chamberlain was catastrophically wrong. Think about the sheer weight of that for a second. If highly trained intelligence officers and incredibly powerful world leaders completely fail to accurately assess honesty and intent, whether they've met the person once or a dozen times, what chance do the rest of us have? What is fundamentally broken in our psychological wiring? Well, these two mysteries point us right to the core psychological concepts Gladwell uses to explain our massive blind spots. Which brings us to Theory 1, defaulting to the truth. The very first reason strangers are so incredibly difficult for us to figure out is what's called the truth default theory. We inherently want to give people the benefit of the doubt. In fact, we are literally wired to believe that people are telling us the truth. We default to that trusting state unless, and this is a huge unless, we sense a specific trigger. Maybe it's a nervous twitch or a jarring inconsistency that suddenly forces us out of that default mode and arouses our suspicion. But if we don't see an obvious red flag, we just assume they're being honest. And what's really fascinating here is the hard data backing this up. Imagine I showed you a video of 100 people telling a story. Half are telling the absolute truth, and half are looking right into the camera and flat out lying. Do you think you could spot the liars? Well, in research studies doing exactly this, participants were astonishingly bad at it. They identified the liars only about 30% of the time, but they were well over 50% accurate when picking out the truth tellers. We are just heavily biased toward believing what we hear. So the crucial point here is that this truth default creates a massive vulnerability, and it all depends on who we're actually talking to. Gladwell points out two types of people. First, you have match senders. These are folks whose outsides completely match their insides. If they're being honest, they look honest. If they're lying, they look incredibly guilty. We are nearly 100% accurate at reading match senders. But then you have mismatch senders. Their actions completely contradict reality. They are lying through their teeth, but they look perfectly calm and honest, just like that spy Ana Montes. And when we deal with mismatch senders, our accuracy absolutely plummets to just 25%. All right, moving on to Theory 2, the transparency myth. This brings us directly to the second major reason we get strangers so wrong. It's called the transparency myth. Just think about the classic TV sitcom Friends. On that show, you can instantly tell exactly what is going on inside a character's head just by watching their exaggerated facial expressions. And the thing is, we've been conditioned to expect strangers in real life to be entirely transparent, just like that. We think a surprised person is going to gasp and widen their eyes, or a guilty person will avoid eye contact and start sweating. But this is a completely misleading assumption. You simply cannot read a stranger's face like a TV character. Often the stranger right in front of you is a mismatch sender, and expecting TV-level transparency is going to completely throw off your radar. And that leads us to Theory 3, coupling and context. Let's look at the third piece of this puzzle, which fundamentally shifts how we view individual actions. It's known as coupling. We have this terrible habit of looking at strangers purely as standalone individuals in a vacuum. But to actually understand them, we have to realize that their behavior is often tightly linked, or coupled, to very specific circumstances, conditions, and places. The stranger you just met might be acting a certain way purely because of the exact situation you've met them in, not because of some deep-seated, permanent personality trait. A really powerful and, frankly, surprising example of coupling involves the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, you'd logically think that if someone has made the tragic decision to commit suicide and they're stopped from jumping off a specific bridge, they'll just go find another way to do it, right? But studies prove this assumption completely wrong. When people were stopped from jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, less than 5% of them ever persisted in taking their own lives another way. That behavior was tightly coupled to that very specific location. Take away the bridge, and the behavior didn't happen. Now let's look at what happens when these theories collide and a tragic misunderstanding. When you combine our truth default, the transparency myth, and our failure to understand coupling, the real-world results can be devastating. By neutrally examining the source analysis of the Sandra Bland case, we see a textbook failure of how strangers read one another. In July 2015, Bland was pulled over by a Texas state trooper for a very minor offense, failing to signal a lane change. According to the analysis, the officer was using a policing tactic meant for high-crime areas, basically stopping minor offenses to look for greater crimes. But this was a low-crime highway, so right out of the gate, the context, the coupling, was totally wrong. The officer unnecessarily abandoned his truth default. As a result, Bland, who stated she only changed lanes to get out of the trooper's way, got understandably irritated by the unnecessary escalation. But the officer misread her reaction entirely. He perceived her irritation not as frustration, but as a dangerous threat. And tragically, 3 days after being arrested, Bland committed suicide in police custody. This is a textbook fatal failure of the transparency myth. Because Bland wasn't transparent, in the exact way the officer expected, because her visible agitation was actually a sign of situational stress and not criminal intent, the officer misread her completely. He looked at a stranger, assumed he could perfectly read her internal motives based on her external expression, and got it tragically wrong. So what is the final takeaway from all of this? Where does this leave us? Knowing that humans are just inherently terrible at detecting lies, knowing that we falsely expect everyone to wear their emotions on their sleeves, and knowing we constantly ignore the context of a person's behavior, how do we proceed? Well, it comes down to this core philosophy from Gladwell. The right way to talk to strangers is with caution and humility. We have to accept that we are constantly dealing with limited, often deeply flawed information. We've got to recognize our own vulnerabilities to match or mismatch senders. We literally have to abandon our transparency myths and remember that people aren't sitcom characters. When dealing with strangers, we simply need to take extra time and put in the extra effort to truly understand them, instead of just jumping to rapid, unsupported conclusions. I want to leave you with that thought to carry into your very next interaction. We are all so incredibly quick to trust our gut instinct the second someone walks into a room, but maybe, actually, almost certainly, our gut doesn't know the whole story. So next time, will you confidently trust your first impression, or will you pause, exercise a little humility, and look closer? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this gives you a completely new lens through which to view the world.